You're looking for the, I can share my screen as well. Like I don't know how great of a grasp everybody has had. I suppose I should ask, like, how did everybody find the reading, if they did the reading? Alicia, go on.
Yeah, it was I mean, yeah, it's dense, I suppose. Particularly the middle, kind of going through, when he's kind of going through, what part is it? That kind of like
The
going
fourfold.
through the fourfold, yeah, and there's kind of relationship of man to space and space to the fourfold, and that part of it, I mean, I had to read most of it like 2 or 3 times, but that part of it, definitely in the middle, was kind of hard to follow. It's helpful to have the little introduction in the beginning and to go back and read the introduction after you've read it. And like, I mean, in the introduction, it even says it's really like, you know, we don't really know, or no one wants to try to explain what he meant by this fourfold. They didn't try to explain it, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I took from it, I think I may as well introduce it now that we've started talking.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I guess he's kind of saying that, like, there's this essential element of buildings and being that go beyond our kind of like boundaries of language, that these like fundamental characteristics that we have, that dwelling has, that kind of explain the deeper meaning of dwelling, and go beyond how we can explain them. And he kind of uses like language, and uses the original meaning of the language that we use today, and kind of traces that language back to its roots, and uses that original meaning to explain how he gets to this argument of essentialism, I suppose. And yeah, I mean, I guess he kind of goes through like all the relationships of mortals to space and this fourfold thing, and basically kind of comes to the conclusion that, like, if we kind of, well, the reading I took from it in the end, in the kind of conclusion, was that we kind of are a little bit homeless, and that dwelling is kind of being, the dwelling is within you rather than a physical, tangible thing. It's got this fundamental basis in something else beyond what we can describe. And that was kind of what the conclusion I took from the end. But he does go through the kind of like literal building as kind of self-preservation and cultivation, and building as the third one, which is the kind of the deeper meaning of being. So it's hard to follow his train of thought, but when you kind of do reflect on it, when I reflected on it, that was the kind of conclusion I came to.
Can you say something, Alicia, about what he says about gathering, and particularly when he talks about the bridge? What's that idea? Can you explain that?
That definitely was kind of, I found that hard to follow. I think, well, what did he, let's see if I wrote it down.
He was talking about
bridge gathers. What is it gathering? What does the bridge do?
I suppose it kind of, it creates this site for this fourfold thing to take place.
He was talking about how bridges create what he calls a locale, and like this idea that even though the bridge is in a location, but it creates the circumstances for the creation of space, because Heidegger's almost arguing that space is more like a phenomenon rather than an actual physical thing.
And that it kind of in one way gathers things and then releases it back to the sky. Talks a lot about the relationship there with the fourfold.
Yeah, I almost thought there was something of a criticism of modernity in the text itself, where it was talking. He was almost kind of arguing that we've lost what it means to dwell, and thereby what it means to be. I don't know if anybody wants to talk on that.
For sure. No, absolutely. It was really interesting to see if it was almost a mindset. So there's the if you look at it in a way, there's theories around whatever language you speak is the mindsets that you have on life and things like that. And bringing it back to Old English and Old German and High German is an interesting way of saying that we had, like hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, we had these concepts of dwelling, and we've lost them through our advancement as it is. And I guess it's probably a critique of modernity, but we also haven't had that idea of dwelling probably for the last at least 400 years, if not more. So it's something that we've lost almost with no living memory of as well, which I find interesting. So we're trying to rediscover that from just random scraps. And I don't know really how you would go about doing that, but it seems almost like a bit of archaeology from something we don't have like firsthand experience of.
I think it's kind of interesting in the fact that he's talking about the relationship between building and dwelling, and that building. I think how does he starts it by saying it's the interesting. He's like, we attain to dwelling, so it seems, only by means of building, and that like our current understanding is that we build in order to dwell, which kind of I suppose reinforces the position of the architect as like the master of dwelling, because in a way architects are the facilitators of space. It can be argued at least that that's what an architect is, and Heidegger's kind of almost drilling or chipping away at the integrity of the profession of architecture, perhaps indirectly.
I kind of think, like architects are facilitating the space, but I wouldn't go as far as saying that they're the masters of it, because I think that what he's saying is that dwelling has a kind of this fundamental character beyond what we can describe or beyond what we can attain to. And that, like, I think he explains that with by demonstrating our relationship with language, that we always think that language is, that we dominate language, whereas in actual fact, language dominates us, and that we're forgetting what dwelling is, because we don't remember anymore, or we don't think that the language we're using is we only extract the simplest meaning from language, but actually language exists before us, and things exist before us, attributing language to them at all. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that we're masters of it, but definitely, I think we facilitate it.
Yeah, but I think like, do we have an over inflated sense of importance in that regard?
We
as in architects.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not sure if the essay addresses the architect so much as. I don't know if he does it in this essay, but he does it a lot, where he talks about some kind of heimat, some very, very traditional. I think he does mention this, doesn't he? An ancient cottage somewhere. There's a peasant. There's a German peasant somewhere who has some immediate relationship to the earth, to dwelling. And this, by the way, was what we're too long into this conversation without bringing up his Nazism, because what facilitated Heidegger's Nazism. No, this isn't a joke. This is like, Derrida is very serious. Makes a really good point here. If Heidegger had ever renounced his Nazism, his philosophy would be a lot less interesting. It's because he never recanted that makes his philosophy so interesting, and it contains within it these claims to overcome certain problems in the world by some recourse or return to some mythological unity or oneness between man and nature and production and all of these things. And that building, this is why I suggest that architecture maybe isn't within his sights, because that would be to give too much to the field of rationality and instrumentality, which is the enemy. Heidegger is opposed to, like Nietzsche before him, opposed to metaphysics, opposed to the whole notion of a subject in the world operating on the world or in any way appraising the world from any kind of a distance. He wants to return to some kind of unity that like a before the fall in the Garden of Eden. I mean, really, the stuff about the fourfold, I'm sorry, is just complete nonsense. You know,
Yeah.
there's no such thing as God, let alone mortals and gods and all that sort of stuff. And even the thing about dwelling in Old German, if you look it up, it doesn't mean being. He's just made that up. Like,
Yeah,
dwelling means to delay. And the most common use of dwelling is to dwell uselessly and negatively on something. You know, you're dwelling on your failure. You should move on. That's what it means.
Does
But
that
why
not
is
take
it that
Augusto, out of his argument then? Like, how can you have built a whole essay on this now if it's made it up?
Yeah, and also, like, why do, if that is the case, why do we use the word dwelling to refer to where we live? Like, I remember in first year they were like, you can't call it a house, you can't call it, you have to call it a dwelling because it's more ambiguous or whatever, or pertains to something that's bigger than just living, or, you know.
Well, maybe that's the meaning that we put on it. You know, that's maybe like this kind of simpler meaning that we've extracted from it. Like, we're not actually paying attention to its original meaning anymore. So we're attributing this grandiose meaning.
He does, and he refers to housing shortages in the essay, and this is very significant because then, as now, the importance for society about dwelling and housing is access, is equality, and the conditions when he wrote Being on Time and this essay a bit later, the conditions were, they got a bit easier by the time he wrote this essay, but he achieved his philosophical maturity at a time of great difficulty and upset in Germany and Europe, and housing is a major issue. He really, a lot of Heidegger's project is to discount this mere utility of housing, this mere question of housing and shortage and utility in favor of, and it clearly is an ideological move, just like with Nietzsche before him, to overcome the problems of actual relationship between us and the world in real terms by recourse to some mythology. And Schelling is the key thing. This year I was reading people in a group in Canada, and I had to, last year rather, went through Schelling's, forget the name of the book now. Oh my God, it's such a nightmare, the whole thing. But it's a philosophy grounded in this notion of ontology. Everything is reduced to being as a kind of an absolute. It's Terry Eagleton says it's an aestheticization of philosophy. It's actually making everything into art and invading the entire field. In that sense, you could say that it suits the architect's program.
So does that mean that Heidegger's writing here is completely in vain? Like there's nothing really that we should take away from it, or
no? Just remember what Derrida said. It's so interesting that he never recounted his Nazism, and because it's not in vain, it very much represents a current of reaction. It's a very profound current of reaction to the alienation of capitalist culture, which is, you know, he goes back over the heads of Hegel and Marx and Kant to an earlier time, or to because it's a way of somehow or other dealing with this crisis of dualism, this alienation. It's a very real problem. So Heidegger really does provide an answer to a real problem of alienation. Just that
it's just not a very good answer. Yes. Mark, I agree with you completely. I agree with Mark completely. I mean, I don't think that it wasn't in vain, Steph, you know, Heidegger's writing. I mean, it's not in vain in the sense that it can only really be understood if you realize that he was essentially, I mean, he's buying into the whole sort of Wagnerian notion of the fatherland and of Tannhäuser and all of this. It's a sort of it's a type of romanticism that accepts so many things as given as first principles that it just can't be argued with. Everything is justified. The whole thing is justified from beginning to end. And he neatly made an argument for the fatherland and for a lot of Nazism. So yeah, I think it's not in vain. I think it's well worth our while to go back and have a look at these texts to see how people can manipulate words in order to get people to think a certain way. I think, you know, this kind of thing could happen again.
That's very true. No, I was actually, I know Zizek has written as well about language being the root of all violence. I don't know how that might relate into this, but you know, I think we've talked a lot about the fact that he's using words, however falsely it might be, to create this identity of, perhaps not identity, but create this image of dwelling and the act of living, the act of existing, to be more than just nothingness.
Can I add, thanks, Steph, just, I read an interesting just footnote from a translation that I was looking at, a guy called Adam Bobeck, who's the first one that popped up in Google, where he said something interesting about the use of the word dwelling, that the original word that Heidegger uses is wohnen. That's a very common word in German language, and it refers, it's kind of like our version of living. So it's been translated as dwelling, but if you were translated into a different way, you'd want to use a word that people in the English language use very commonly. So that would be living. So, I mean, I don't know, does that change things drastically? But it just points to the fact that there's a particular focus on particular words, and that, you know, people always say this a lot, that you really want to learn, you know, you really want to read it in the original German. They say this about a lot of philosophers. So you kind of have to both acknowledge that we won't fully get it unless you understand or use German in a common way. But it does also point to the fact that he's using German, or in some cases Greek, as representing some sort of essential understanding of being, which you could see why that leads to Nazism. You know, it's like, you know, language is best, i.e. humans are best, that's a problem. And then the German language is best, which comes from Greek. And that's, you know, and there's sort of an inevitability about thinking Germans are best, you know.
Yeah, I think I don't know if he necessarily makes that, because he says at one point that humans like to believe that they are the dictators of language, whereas the dynamic is actually the other way around, where language still dictates humans. So I don't know if that changes anything.
We determine language. Yeah. I've been reading a bit about, because I really enjoyed reading this, because I've never directly read Heidegger. I've only ever read about him and around him and other stuff, and you know, Heidegger for architects and that kind of stuff. Never got like into it, so I'm really grateful for that. But one thing I did read about Heidegger was what Timothy Morton's been saying about Heidegger, the English philosopher. Kind of this book in particular. This is a good one. Strongly recommended. Yeah. And talks about that kind of in some way, he doesn't say the inevitable connection to Heidegger. He thinks that it's a bug in Heidegger's thinking, like in the software that Heidegger ended up involved in Nazism, or, you know, a supporter of it. And that if only he'd thought in a fully Heideggerian way, he would have avoided Nazism. So he's suggesting we need to go all Heideggerian on Heidegger, you know, in order to get out of it.
Doug, that is, now, at the risk of turning this into a philosophical fun fight.
Go for it.
That's exactly, I think, what Derrida was trying to get at. Derrida was trying to insist that there's nothing inconsistent with Heideggerian philosophy and Nazism. The two of them go together. And I think to understand it, we need, what Timothy Morton is saying, as far as I understand from what you say, is that the good bits of Heidegger, let's just accept the good bits of Heidegger, that they are disinterestedness, that we look to the world and we let the world be, we let it be, and we let it, we look at the word I came across is Gelassenheit, a widely passive releasement of things, or the idea of ready to hand or present to hand, that we know that, like Heidegger gets his thing from Husserl and from this guy Brentano, that we know the world through as a field of possibility of the place where we act, so that The world is known to us through our engagement with the objects are not separate from us. The world and us are together. These are all the good things of Heidegger, the things that architects want to retain, that unity between subject and object, that way of overcoming Cartesian dualism, that whole notion of us projecting out onto the world, thereby creating the terrible alienation brought about by industrial capital and so forth. But the reason why we can't keep that and get rid of the Nazism is that the fundamental operation is, it collapses. Somebody quoted Zizek a while ago. Zizek stood up in one of his talks and said, you know, when people talk about the problem with nature is we've got to get back, somehow or other, we've got to get back to nature and be one with nature, and that way we'll overcome. And Jesus says, no, we don't. We need to realize precisely how different we are from nature. Only then do we take responsibility for what we're doing with nature. It's not getting back to nature. We need to really grow up and accept our highly instrumentalized position in relation to non-human nature in order to start behaving like adults in the room. We can't overcome this crisis by returning to some Garden of Eden at which we were all one, because it never existed.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, how does that fit with, like, Timothy Morton talks about nature, the problem of nature with a capital M, the problem of the Gaia theory, because it's not a separate thing. We are it. Like, we are. It's all, nature isn't a separate thing from humans. We are it. And is that not like the problem with, as you were saying at the start, the problem with the X, the fourfold of being four distinct things? I mean, it's nonsense, because they're not distinct categories, human and sky and water and divinities. It's all like, there's not sharp lines between the four things. So we aren't distinct from nature. And that's a problem in architectural thinking as well, to think that nature is this thing that's outdoors, whereas it's like, now this is nature, these communications, sound waves going across the wall behind me is nature, my tie is nature. It's all nature. The community, everything is nature. It's not just in these distinct categories. I was wondering about other people, because somebody said something at the start about this critique of modernism. We've been in third year, we've been doing some modernism readings, both critiques of them and then classical texts. But I was wondering, that didn't strike me as being, anything I read stuck out as being a critique of modernism. But can maybe people expand on that? I didn't see that, but can other people maybe suggest where he did critique modern thinking at the time in the 1950s?
Perhaps I think he was sort of chipping away, maybe not at modernism as a whole, but the sort of this Corbusian idea that buildings exist purely out of utility, so that like living or whatever, what it means to live can be fit inside a box, and can be boiled down to fundamental principles. I think that's kind of what I was getting at when I was like, because he seems to be arguing the opposite. Like, he does in a way seem to be hinting towards this idea of spatial experience and the subjectivity of that. But there is almost a contradiction in how he speaks, in the fact that he's trying to objectify things when he's talking about the fourfold as well.
Yeah. Does that maybe come from, like, he talks about he used the word world, is that kind of suggest that everybody has their own world and there isn't a unifying world, and modernism seems to have been about a unifying single world? Is that I don't know, is that what you mean, that it's subjective?
I think its implicit criticism of modernity is to do with, I think it's more to do with a criticism of rationalism.
Yeah.
Or the idea that rationalism can exist and not be questioned. And this is of course one of the reasons that when young people come across Heidegger now, he can be very seductive, because they like to think that. But I think I wanted to get back to something though that I think is interesting, is that about where he stands. Like, I think what he does is a very neat little trick. There's some part of the essay, or I don't know if it's this essay or some other essay, where he's talking about bridges and how a bridge lands across a river. And then when it lands across the river, a new kind of a space has been made, which we can't deny. And it's all it's seductive, and you get it. So what he does is he says, this exists. And I go, well, God, it sure does exist. I never thought about it before. And then in the next phrase, he sort of says, national, fatherland exists. The relationship of the peasant to the land exists. And he sort of neatly binds the two up in a way that if you accept the one, you accept the other. And I think that's where the danger is.
Yeah.
Modernism.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Steph. Modernism, Doug, isn't probably. It's in a way it's kind of quite a narrow term in a certain branch of aesthetics. That Heidegger's concern is much more to do with rationality, as Gary says, and in fact, indeed, going right back to the whole metaphysics project of subject distinct from the world of objects. And I think it's, particularly against the dualism of Descartes, that to collapse this separation and to immerse us in the world of things. In this essay, by the way, Gary, it's from this essay that he talks about the bridge that you refer to. But when he says, in this, it's a lecture he gave, when he says, now we're all sitting here, but imagine the old gate or the old something at somewhere, the old bridge, and we could be there. In fact, we don't need to be there to be there. That it's in our mind. So it's not strictly idealism in that sense that everything is just produced by our minds. It's more profound. It's more to do with turning all epistemology into ontology. In other words, turning all philosophy of knowledge into a philosophy of being. That's much more Heidegger's project. By the way, we have to understand this as a continuation of the Nietzschean attack on rationality. And this is a part of the Romantic project of the 19th century, part of the crisis of the ruling orders. And you have to understand Heidegger in the context of this. During his youth, Germany went from predominantly agricultural, agrarian, to predominantly industrial. And not only that, but became like the 5th biggest economy in the world in an incredibly short time, but didn't develop a liberal bourgeois class like in England or in France. So it still had this old Junker aristocracy in charge. And then it entered into this massive catastrophe of the First World War, which was directly connected with this expansion and with the contradictions between these massive forces of production and the ancient order of absolute order. And Heidegger was in this story of reaction against both the bourgeois revolution and the socialist. Like the Social Democratic Party in Germany, they were the biggest, and the German Revolution in 1918 was the most incredible thing. And Heidegger was part of a reaction against that. So his Nazism is all tied in with this. It's an attempt to go back to this disinterestedness as a solution to everything. And as Barry says, this is why young people like us, like me, not forgetting the students now, young people like me, why we read Heidegger and go, oh my God, this will solve all our problems. Because if we stop being so grasping and wanting to turn everything into our own instruments, then we can overcome the crisis. No, we can't. Because the crisis is very much more pervasive and it's to do with organization. And we can only do that by precisely adopting a position of otherness and responsibility in relation to the natural world. It's not nature that's a problem. It's bats giving us viruses. And they're giving us viruses because we've killed all the places where they used to live, because we've turned the whole world into a industrial farm. Sorry, I'll stop now. It's us doing these things that are producing these crises of nature, not nature. It's our role. Therefore, the solution resides in our role.
But surely there's an argument to be made that's only happening, that's only happening because we have lost touch. Not because we have lost touch, but because we have systematically dismantled all of the natural checks and balances that would exist. And surely that is reinforced by the fact that over the last 200-300 years, there has been exponential population growth because of this human hegemony. of the world.
It's inextricable though. The moment the very earliest farmers began to discover, I mean, you can read this in various places, that by interfering with the way plants grow, they could nudge them towards different yields, and they could start to, that was the very beginning of it, interfering in the natural process in order to bring about a better outcome for the farmer. And then, you know, obviously the major thing then was, you know, the whole notion of surplus, which is a farming idea based on farming, which led directly to the earliest European and other cities storing and protecting surpluses. And this leads to the notion of ultimately of capital and of profit.
I think referring to that as interfering with the natural order almost suggests that there's a certain way of thinking that we have, that we are not at odds, but like we are something different. Like I think that idea of taking advantage of something that is recognized, it's not just something that humans do. Every species does something like that. That's part of the natural process, to recognize, perhaps not in a conscious way like one might argue that humans do, but to recognize that there are vulnerabilities that a species can take advantage of in order to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree totally. It's in our nature to outperform other parts. That's in our nature.
But it's not just our nature. It's in nature.
Yeah,
that is the natural process. The natural process is in fact self-destructive.
And do we know, I'm just putting this question out there, maybe someone knows the answer, but obviously, like you were saying, Heidegger never renounced his Nazism, but do we know, and maybe I'm answering my own question here, but do we know then what he ever thought of Nazism's impact on humanity and that process is impact?
Well, he was a member of the party.
He what?
He was a member of the party.
The biggest condemnation of him is the chair of Freiburg University, which he held. It was only for a year, not even a year, in the 30s. But he, in that role, he acted as an ideologue of Nazism, and that was the biggest indictment against him. I don't think he ever commented on the Holocaust. Is what you mean, Leisha? I don't think he ever did.
Yeah, he did never, I suppose, self-critique his ideas in the context of Nazism's failure, for want of a much better word, but he didn't ever have any kind of self-critique there.
No.
No.
Could I maybe I could read this short passage. It's just not even a page from this.
Yeah,
it's kind of good. It's kind of good, and I'm kind of maybe pushing the argument that humans aren't different, and the problem, the idea that humans are different is that idea that humans are different is part of the problem. Anyway, this is Timothy Morton saying, Heidegger argued that only humans have a full-on rich world, while life forms that wriggle around, animals, are poor in world, and things such as stones have no world at all. There is no reason for him to assert this, and, double trouble, his assertion means that for him, world is totally sealed and solid, which on the basis of his own theory, where things can't be grasped directly, just can't be true. Nazism for Heidegger was a way for him to cover over and ignore and keep anthropocentrically safe from the most radical implications of his own theory. In fact, many Western philosophers since have sought refuge from the outer limits weirdness of their own theories in all sorts of ways to avoid them outstripping what they think they want their thoughts to do. Maybe they're afraid of what people might think, or maybe they're just afraid of what they might think, which could be out of step with how they otherwise live their lives. So that anthropocentrically, that means humans at the center of everything. Yeah. And that as an idea, which is like a Christian Judeo idea, that we are at the center of everything, humans, and we are distinct in that way. That's a pretty difficult thing to break away from if it's been, part of your society for centuries, since the start of the, as Marx says, the industrial agricultural age. So, once you're in that, if only he'd gone a little bit more Heideggerian on himself and accepted the weirdness of things and the, as he says, the things that things don't have complete defined edges, then he might have, that outer limit weirdness, he might have gone to a different place.
Yeah, I think the anthropocentric nature of his writing perhaps is not it. Perhaps anthropocentrism is not something that's limited to like Judeo-Christian
No.
outlooks, but I think it's something it's very easy as a human to think about humans, like it's something that crops up over and over again, this idea that we are the only conscious beings on planet Earth, like we're the only ones that can think, and that rationality is an inherently human thing. I think
Even the thing of language you mentioned, it brought up like this thing that cats do, that Timothy Morton also pointed out, that cats learned to meow. You know, they learn when they started living with humans, they meow, meow, because it's like milk, milk, they want, you know, that's a learned thing, to use language with humans in a particular way, to be fed. So it's just not true. Like, it happens at different levels, use of language, obviously, but it's even the idea of humans as being distinct from what do you call it, Neanderthals. That's not true either. Like, that we are, like, Homo sapiens is a thing that exists as a distinct niche package of a thing. That's not true. There's all sorts of blurring of the edges.
I think, Doug, that part of the problem is that, you know, over the years, going back to the Greeks, I suppose, the human condition, the day-to-day of life, is always, or not always, but is frequently pitched, you know, as some sort of dichotomy. That there is, are we, you know, does the mind-body continuum exist or not? Are we rational? Are we irrational? Are we emotional? Are we, I think, even say, for example, even within the Christian tradition, there is no one Christian tradition. There's the transcendent and the immanent. And when pitched in this sort of a way, you know, it's a false argument, because one is put in the position of saying, well, I favor one over the other, when of course the answer is that neither are correct. The human condition is the human condition. We're neither immanent nor transcendent. And that's I suppose that element of Heidegger and Nietzsche before, and others, Husserl maybe to a degree, it's a sort of a hectoring cry to accept their position. And I find that trouble. That for me is the troublesome part. It is from the very beginning setting out to seduce. Heidegger sets out to seduce.
Yeah, but at the same time, he talks about living in truth. That there isn't a distinction between false and true. I don't know the line, but it's and if only he'd gone down that line of accepting there isn't a clear distinction between true and false. We're always living in truth. That's
true, Doug. He does say these things, but I think the reason why Heidegger is still on the agenda, or why we go back, is because of the problematic things he throws up. The other things he discusses about, like the nature of truth, loads of people have said them before, and much better than he has. The problematic element is the thing that, you know, is still sort of bobbing along the surface.
Can I suggest that the fundamental problem is the move from epistemology to ontology, and that is the philosophical collapse of not how we know, how we understand the world, collapsing that into a theory of being, a theory of ontology. And it's inarguable. There's no way of arguing with it. As Gary said earlier, you can't argue with his theory, because you can't read this essay. You can't read it from any critical position, because how can you argue against his points? They're adduced entirely out of they're plucked out of the air, like this fourfold idea. How do we argue with that? Like, if I started talking like that, you'd all have to say, okay, thanks, Mark. Anyone else? You know, there's no way you could come back at me, because I don't give you anything to argue. Like, if I said to you, on the other hand, our knowledge of the world is determined by a certain set of conditions and so on, you could come back at me. And this is some way the kind of discussion we're having here is about the effect of our position in nature of how we know things. Heidegger, I don't think, could ever be recovered from his Nazism, Doug, because despite what your learned writer Timothy Morgan says, using this legal thing, when we say our learned colleague means that person's talking shite. And my most noble learned colleague means wait till I get you outside. But despite what he said, I don't think we can, I think Derrida's right. And I think the fundamental move of Heidegger is to try and resolve the crisis. I'm going to read Terry Eagleton here, his great essay in his book on the ideology of the aesthetic about, he says the hubristic humanist subject is properly dislodged from, this is by Heidegger, from its virile preeminence, but only to adopt the servile acquiescence of the lackey, because we are all meant to be humble in this presence of the fourfold and so on. Heidegger's philosophy exemplifies one destination of the idea of the aesthetic in the 20th century as a ruling class in grave crisis, discovered in the disinterestedness of being, capital B, the very discourse it requires to mystify its own ruthlessly instrumental activity, taken to its most ruthlessly instrumental in the industrial murder of 6 million people and many others by the Nazis. Because there was no point at which the argument could be refuted, because it wasn't a properly philosophical argument.
It's kind of like the essay from last week, where is it, like if you argue against it, it's almost reinforcing the argument as a fundamental thing, because the only rebuttal to any argument against it is, well, it's fundamental. It's a really hard position to argue against. I wanted to ask as well, like both Gary and Mark and Doug as well, like you've been saying we, like the reason why we come back to this, and this is, this we, is this we a collective we, or is this architects? And if it's a collective we, might I ask, how does this come back to how we understand architecture?
Just to extend that question, Steph, could any of the students say if they've read Heidegger at any stage, and if you found Heidegger useful? Because, well, if you had it, don't be ashamed of it, because the stuff is amazing, and that branch of phenomenology is it's an incredibly fertile source of ideas for architects. You have to hold on to that part of Heidegger where he does try to break down our alienation. But has any of the students used Heidegger?
Well, might be something to ask Leisha. You said you read it last semester.
No, I actually didn't. I got it confused with another philosopher. I can't remember it now, but I think Samantha did give it out to some people.
It was last semester. It was
Bordeaux.
They had quoted Heidegger in a text that we looked at, which was like the cabin in the woods, the like peasant's home, and how it's like part of its environment. And I suppose like we were just questioning that.
What was the text you were reading, Alice? What was that?
I can't remember. I'll go and check now. Don't
worry. It's just so curious.
But no, I had never read him then before this week. And yeah, I think I would want to read more of them, because they are like yeah, I hadn't really thought of what you're saying there, Mark, that you can't argue with them. And now that you said it, it is kind of like a light bulb moment that it's his ideas are like really seductive, to use Gary's word, and that's probably why I want to go and learn more. But that's the problem with it, isn't it? That you you can't just accept it for what it is.
Can I throw something in here? You know, the Wizard of Oz, and they discover that they go and the wizard is there, and then they see this curtain and they pull it back, and there's this nice little old chap operating the wizard. And well, in terms of Richview, Heidegger is the little old man in the. Doug is showing us something. Is that
a picture? That's Heidegger, is it?
Yeah. So in terms of Richview, Heidegger is the little old man in the Wizard of Oz pulling the strings. And the reason is as follows. The most influential philosophy on this school, every school has its philosophies, could be said to be what they call Cambridge School, which is, for various reasons, we won't go into now, but Cambridge School is dominated by a couple of characters, Peter Carl, a guy called Dalibor Vesely, who passed away, and they're within that phenomenology branch. And people who go and do their masters in Cambridge in architecture under Peter Carroll, they all have to read Being on Time, this Heidegger's main book. And they are all well versed in this. And you see it enrich you in terms of I call it kind of slow architecture, that concern with materiality in its tactile sense, the haptics, a kind of production which is very much looks back to a kind of craft production which eschews obvious evidence of technology, advanced technology. And that's broad. I mean, I'm really, really crudely reducing this all now, but you can definitely, this Heidegger has his hands on this quite profoundly. And it's through this idea of phenomenology, which has all this amazing power to it. And we're spending a lot of time here, some of us anyway, going on about the downside of it. And Doug is saying, well, you can separate the two. You can have Heidegger without Nazism. And I'm going to say, well, it doesn't matter whether you have Heidegger without Nazism, because you're still losing epistemology, or you're losing critical philosophy. You're taking, Heidegger took from Kant one thing, which was his disinterestedness of his aesthetics, and he expanded them to cover everything, so that there's nothing now except sitting around and being in the world, gathering, releasing, all of these terms of somehow or other passively being at one with everything. And we think this is a solution.
But Steph, to clarify the we, my own perspective is I wasn't sure I was using that term, because I don't have that direct experience of like us tutors all sitting around in our tweeds, ties and cardigans talking about Heidegger. I've never had a conversation with anybody about Heidegger in all of my time. And you might correct me that it was actually on our reading list 20 years ago, but I don't remember reading it in UCD 20 years ago. So, but that's not to say it doesn't come indirectly through like our external examiner here. If I got this right, Adam Shar, so this is his book, and yeah, so that's true. And then, Dalibor and Eric Parry and all those guys and Peter Carroll there. So it's indirect, definitely. But it's not the case we're sitting around, chatting.
Bunch of white guys sitting around a table talking about Heidegger.
No, this is great. This is why maybe things will change by sitting around talking about it, because it's like, okay, now we actually know what's happening for the first time. It's not. We don't go back to Heidegger in any direct way as tutors that that I've ever experienced. So
Nolan, I don't think that's, I recognize the lineage you're talking about, Mark, and I think people recognize it, but I sort of think it's indirect, as Doug says. I don't think like any previous generations of people teaching in UCD were preaching it directly, although they may have been living it, let's say.
Is it possible that it's what's the word, like a confirmation bias, that like it so happens like there are different camps when it comes to architecture, different views, etc. It's possible that like UCD is almost acting as a filter, like people come to teach here who are people of similar mind come to teach here.
Yeah, that's true. That was our essay last week. A lot of we touched on that. It's true. And going back to your question, Steph, about this is the problem, isn't it? We humans have got to stop knocking down the Amazon rainforest. But actually, I don't know anyone involved in knocking down the Amazon rainforest. Well, actually, now that you mention it, I do, because I was going down to the supermarket after this is over, and the chances are I'm going to pick up something which I've got as a result of knocking down the Amazon rainforest. Where do you make these?
That's something like not coconut, palm oil.
Yeah.
Anything with palm oil in. Yeah.
The thing I'm interested in is not my complicity. Obviously, my complicity in the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, everyone knows it. It's notorious. But apart from the actual complicity in the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, which I'm not joking, I am complicit in it as being part of this global system of production. Thing I'm most interested in, for what it's worth, is the ideologies which sustain this beyond its obvious exposure. the ideologies that sustain it, and I believe phenomenology is one of those. It's an ideology of disinterestedness.
Mark, I would make a separation, a distinction between phenomenology per se and Heidegger's ontology, as you say. His is ontology. It would seem to me that people like Merleau-Ponty, for instance, who I think probably is closer to where UCD is coming from, Husserl, are actually much more, I'm not as good as the language as you are, but much more epistemological in the sense that they are much more interested in how it is that people make sense of and interact with the world, in its own terms, rather than trying to get a philosophy of being out of it.
And the phenomenology is precisely that. It is a way. It's broadly speaking, it's a way in which we know the world through our action in it, and therefore through our relation to it. So therefore, in its own terms. Yeah. So I mean, they were all influenced by Heidegger. I mean, Sartre even went apparently to Berlin way back in the 1930, and because they were all there being blown away by Husserl's new philosophy. And by the way, this is an amazing philosophy. Of course, we know things. It's just when it gets to the point where it becomes an ontology, when there's a theory of being adduced from it, which then becomes an ideology, which can be seen to just keep things the way they are. I mean, this is the other thing about Heidegger is, at the end of Heidegger, things just stay the way they are. And at the end of every Peter Carl essay, brilliant and all as they are, I'm left thinking, well, isn't it great? Everything's great. Everything's for the best in the best possible worlds in one way. This is a way in which, this is probably, isn't this a line between those who want to go out and change things, or people who just discovering through philosophy how to love life, maybe?
Then it just in those terms, like if you compare, I mean, maybe I'm just trying to make sense of why I much prefer to read Merleau-Ponty than Heidegger, because Merleau-Ponty is much more concerned with how things are experienced.
Yeah,
exactly. Like what it is to look at Cézanne, and Cézanne doesn't paint how the world is. He paints the question of how we experience the world, etc. And that's just it. He's not trying to then develop that into a theory of being. He's just talking about it as this helps us to understand how it is that our bodies,
I think that's
ourselves interact with the world. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's true, Hugh. Yeah.
I think it would be a shame to throw that out.
Yeah.
I told on tight to Merleau-Ponty and Bachelard and people like that. I don't really necessarily see a huge point of connection between them and Heidegger. And in all honesty, I don't really know if I personally anyway, see Heidegger in a sense as a phenomenologist in the way that most people would understand it. I see him as a branch apart. I mean, frequently, I don't know why this comes up. I was curious about Steph's question, why do we say we? I don't know, Steph. I mean, it just struck me about 5 or 6 years ago, somebody asked the question, are the fourth years reading Heidegger? And I thought, oh God, I didn't even know they were reading Heidegger. And suddenly, for some reason, it's on the agenda. It's just there, and it just gets discussed. But I think there's sort of there's Merleau-Ponty and the phenomenologists, and there's Heidegger.
Yeah. Leisha, you still there? You were going to say something a couple minutes ago. So.
I was going to just say something earlier, because I was just thinking there, listening to you in when I kind of introduced it, I was talking about kind of at the ending, and we touched on it earlier about housing, and Mark was saying how important it is that Heidegger puts the housing thing into this essay, and just made me question my reading of it, I suppose, because he was saying that if you're dwelling, then that's your being, just realized that is hard to argue with, but then really rationally, you in the real world you still need to have a physical dwelling, you kind of he's not really rooted in the real world, is he, in this sense?
But that's kind of phenomenology, though. Phenomenology is trying to understand how we understand the physical world.
But then fundamentally, is it all just kind of not really useful?
Is it all just nonsense? I think
I think
it's certainly some.
Yeah, I think phenomenology. I think we can join. I mean, I don't labour this too much, but we can join these phenomenologists under this general broad umbrella that they understand. They try to describe how we understand the world in terms of phenomena, which is how things appear to us, rather than a description of objects in themselves. The fundamental thing that they all share is abandoning the thing in itself as an object of study, the thing that existed before humans appeared. And so even with Merleau-Ponty, I think there is the fundamental abandonment of the other is what is which is why we end up with always with these practices, wonderful and all as they are, we always end up with a kind of the status quo. Why I call them ideologies, because the other, which is the thing that the kind of tickling object that from who's that from that comes in that we can't get rid of, that thing that's upsetting, the pea under all those mattresses in the fairy tale, is the thing that critical philosophy in the Kantian tradition and the Cartesian tradition is, and the Marxist tradition. I mean, ultimately, I come back to the Marxists and even Hegelian Marxist tradition of a dialectic between ultimately between subjects and objects. And yes, it's true that it is this distinction which caused the alienation, the destruction of nature, and so on. But it is also this distinction which we have to stay with, that through which we have to go forward. We can never return to a Garden of Eden before we started. That's why I mentioned earlier this kind of interference in crop cycles, which they say goes back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. It's like we were just so damn clever. Other species at finding out how to turn nature to our benefit.
Leisha, I think there's something interesting there when you were asking about the, why would we sort of essentially bother with a lot of the phenomenologists? Excuse me. I think there is something that we can sort of hook onto, which is that as architects, there's always this kind of difficulty about, like, we organize space, we make space, but like, what does that mean? What is the space without the materials that form the space? If you take all materiality away, what are we left with? And it's in trying to come to, and yet somehow we all know that space has character, otherwise we wouldn't be in this game. So we all know that, and we're all striving to sort of do the best for our clients to create like a space, the thing. And it's only when you try and arrive at it through some form of phenomenological mental gymnastics that you sort of feel like, you're doing the job. You take that bit out, it's really hard to know what it is you're doing at all. So, I mean, that's where I don't know, I find that for me,
it's kind of left out to just pure function, which isn't what we were taught to do.